everyone. My name is Cara Romano, and I would like to welcome you all to today's webinar, Connection's latest Connectors Conversation Panel, a web discussion designed to bring thought-provoking perspectives and brilliant protagonists together around a timely topic to cultivate community growth. We appreciate your participation and would especially like to thank Legion Star, that sits at the crossroads of the cloud, ERP, and security, for their support in sponsoring this event. Cyber attacks have been front page news recently, from the Colonial Pipeline to SolarWinds to the Microsoft Exchange hack and more. In the aftermath of these attacks, it's become even more critical to learn about digital threats to your business and understand how to manage network security. Some stats for you here. Cybercrime is predicted to inflict damages totaling $6 trillion with a T, dollars globally in 2021. Yet global spending on cybersecurity is only around $145 billion, so a big discrepancy there. Today's discussion will shed light on the magnitude of this threat. We'll discuss important differences between compliance and security and explain why business process change should be part of any security initiative. Unfortunately, most companies wait until after a breach to address weaknesses, and this session will open your eyes to the dangers that have become way too common in the cloud era. Excuse me. We have three speakers joining us to connect the dots, and although they have very different responsibilities and come from different backgrounds, I think you're going to be amazed at the common connections. So to start, each of them will provide a few comments about a key issue, and then I'm going to step back and let them chat. We may have some time for a short Q&A at the end, so if you've got questions, use the comment function on YouTube. If we don't get to all of them, we'll follow up within 24 hours. So first, a little bit about our speakers. Dave Elliott has been a leader in technology management for 30 years and has focused on the long-term goals of the finance, manufacturing, distribution, and consulting companies he has worked for, including Reebok and Adidas. He is experienced in project management and recently implemented a comprehensive disaster recovery strategy after experiencing a ransomware attack. Our second speaker has been a noteworthy leader in the identity and access management space for over 21 years, working with companies like Novell and Savient. He has helped many Fortune 500 companies develop their identity and security strategy, and now brings his knowledge and expertise of IAM, cloud and application security to Legion Star as their CTO. And last but not least, Terry Cutler is the CEO of Cyology Labs and the author of the Amazon bestseller, Insider Secrets to Internet Safety, Advice from a Professional Hacker. He is also the creator of the top family-based internet safety training program. He's a government-approved cybersecurity expert and was named to IFSEC Global's top 20 most influential people in cybersecurity in 2018, 2019, and again in 2020. So with those introductions, I want to thank you all again for attending, and let's get going. So Dave, we're going to start with you. Unfortunately, you were the victim of a wicked ransomware attack, your words, and we would like to use your experience, honestly, as a warning to others. So can you share your story with our audience? So explain what happened and what did it take to get back to business as usual?
Okay. Thanks, Cara. So I was working with a large manufacturing company who was experiencing some growing pains. And one of those pains was, a lack of security, a lack of disaster recovery solutions. And, we had been in the process of just beginning to look at that and had signed an agreement with a company that provided security to us. And it was somewhat lacking. We really weren't sure what we were doing at the time. And we weren't really sure how much security we needed. We felt like we had a good grasp of, our network and some of the threats that we were seeing, and quickly realized that wasn't the case. Kind of like, cybersecurity in some ways is kind of like insurance. You have it, and if you don't ever use it, it's there, and people don't get too excited about it until something happens, obviously. So that was the case with us. We didn't spend a lot of money up front, and the solution that we had didn't really provide us a lot of security at all. So one day a normal day, until we had a user call and report a big red skull and crossbones across their screen. And so started looking into it, and within a matter of minutes, we were getting calls from everybody. So we clearly knew we had a problem. We had been doing some business with a company called Pondurance out of Indianapolis. Great company, great forensics company. So we contacted them, and they were right on the ball to come and begin helping figure out what we had. And so we quickly saw that the problem that we had was pretty widespread, and over the next few days realized that it had gotten all of our devices, it had gotten every server, it even got our backups because of the way we were structured. Those were vulnerable, and how this got in, and again, another hole that we had a Gmail attachment. Somebody's personal Gmail account had gotten hacked about a month before they actually kicked it off. So they were in our system for probably a good month and a half before they kicked it off. So they got a pretty good look at what we had, and were pretty prepared by the time they kicked it off. At that point, we brought in Pondurance. We also brought in another third party to help us start to rebuild and to kind of figure out, where we wanted to go from there. The ransomware or the folks that kicked off the ransom were asking for $200,000. Honestly, they could have asked for $2 million, and we probably would have had to pay it. We were sitting there pretty vulnerable. We did determine that the attack came from somewhere in Eastern Europe. And we also determined that there were actually two groups, and Terry and Nabil, you guys, I'm sure, see this all the time, but it was one group that did the hack, and then another group that they sold it to that dealt with the ransom. So the 200K needed to be paid in Bitcoin, so we had to employ an experienced group to handle that transaction. Which all this is costing money as we go, and it's just adding up. We had to shut down the business for about 3 weeks, and that was because, like I said, it had gotten everything, and we didn't have the ability to take orders. We didn't have the ability to do any manufacturing out in the plant. So we were kind of stuck. Our first area that we tried to get back up and running was our order entry folks. Put them on a separate network and got those folks back up so that we could start at least taking orders. But our manufacturing facility was at a standstill. We didn't have a way to communicate those orders out to the plant, and so we were pretty stuck there. So as we started doing the rebuild, we we had to rebuild every server, every computer. Took the opportunity to buy new computers that were lacking in resources, so we spent some money there. We had $2 million in cyber insurance. We ate that up like that, and as you can imagine, with forensics people in, and we had hardware application people coming in. We ate through that quickly and probably spent, I'm going to guess, it's a private company, so I want to be careful with numbers, but into the millions to get back up and running. I always remember the day that it happened. It was my anniversary, and my wife and I had a nice dinner planned for that evening, and 3 months later, we finally got to have that dinner. So it's one that's going to always stick with me. And so that's kind of the story. Again, rebuilding it took us about 3 months to get to where we were somewhat normal. But quite an experience that I don't really want to live through again. But on the back end of it, I learned so much about how we need to tighten things up. We did a lot of work in tightening up. First thing we did was eliminate any personal email accounts. That was one of the first things, and then really tightened up our rules. We were kind of loose with admin accounts, and I'm sure Terry and Nabil, you yeah. So tightened up a lot of things, made security a very high priority for the business, even to the point where, we did training, got very serious about training our users, and even to the point of, making it part of their performance reviews. We would send out tests and do that periodically, and depending on how people scored on those tests would affect, their performance. It became a part of their performance. So we really made some huge improvements. We signed a new disaster recovery agreement with the local company, and worked with them over the coming months to have a really comprehensive strategy in place. So we ended up obviously much better on the other end, but as Nabil and Terry will tell you, that you there are a lot of holes. There are a lot of things that you have to consider. Risk assessments are key. That's one of the things that we had started doing before all this happened, but had we gotten through that and addressed all the things that we had, seen before, then, we'd have been much better off. But I can't stress enough, the risk assessments, the training of people, and, just making it a priority. There are companies, and we were one too, that, started hiring for positions that were strictly, security positions. So I think those are things that are necessary as well in today's world, as we're seeing on a daily basis. So,
yep.
Yep.
Way too common. We're going to come back to some of those words of wisdom and things that you've learned after. So I want to get to Nabil next. So obviously Dave went through a very unfortunate experience. So I want, as the expert here, can you shed some light on some of these current threats? What's really going on out there, and what can companies do about it? How do organizations figure out where to focus and what they can actually manage? So if you can shed some light on the approach and how severe the threat really is, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'm always a firm believer that ransomware is really just technical debt collection, right? What Dave kind of went through, we're seeing that with a lot of organizations. You're seeing that with the most recent pipeline hack as well, right? You can, what organizations really need to do is balance security with agility. And that's what they're struggling with all the time. Where do you start? How do you go get budget to get all these proactive solutions to minimize that risk, right? At the same time, you don't want to keep screaming, the sky is falling, and try to get all these solutions in place as well. So I think Dave hit the nail right on the head. You got to start with a risk assessment, and it's got to be cybersecurity focused, right? With today's most organizations doing a huge business transformation, cloud and digital are front and center of that transformation. So cybersecurity is even more important now than it ever was. And at the front of that cybersecurity assessment and implementation of that program should be a strong identity foundation and a framework, right? And you need to not just look at hackers in the sense of external, but insider threat as well, right? So, because what are we all protecting at the end of the day? Intellectual property. That intellectual property can be anything from PII data to files, right? That could give away your secret sauce. So a lot of that, we look at external hackers, we look at insider threat, and it starts with gaining access to that particular individual that holds all that intellectual property. So in the case of Dave's scenario, or his example, it was a Gmail account that they phished. And I'm assuming with some weak passwords, with a lack of strong authentication mechanisms in place, they were probably, looked at their Facebook profile, started farming out, questions around what's your favorite, high school teacher, where did you live, what street did you live? And you find out that those are all challenge response questions to reset someone's password, right? And once you go through that process and, you don't put in some strong authentication behind it to, I always believe in trust but verify. So, yeah, I know you're trying to reset your password, but is it really you, right? So, alerting them that your password is being changed and validating that they say they are who they say they are is step number one, right? And we can talk about, throughout the segment, various ways to protect them. But even with a good identity program, you're never going to stop that insider threat until you figure out how they're using the access, right? So an identity program will always, preach, give right access to the right people at the right time, right? So yes, there's a physician who lives next door to you, and they have access to all the electronic medical records, and they just happen to know that you're admitted to that that hospital where they provide healthcare services. Why are they looking up your information if they're not your primary care physician, right? So little things like that also help. Monitoring how people are using that access to determine where that risk is, right? And organizations aren't trying to eliminate risk; they're trying to minimize it as much as possible, because you're never going to eliminate it. And that's just a fact, because your business is changing, technology is evolving. You just got to be on top of it and start with an assessment, and then figure out what is most critical to you to protect, and start from there.
Okay. We're going to come back to you. Okay, Terry, we hear about black hat and white hat hackers, and I have this vision of like spy versus spy. So what is an ethical hacker? Help us to understand what you really do, and how can you help companies make sure their environments are really secure? Because honestly, it's scary out there, yeah?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, we're not some fat guy living in the mom's basement anymore. Now we dress up. I'm still fat, but I mean, we dress up now. So an ethical hacker essentially is a cybersecurity professional that has similar skills to the bad guys, except we use these skills for good. We get hired by a company to legally hack them and help them find all the holes before the bad guys do. And then at the end, we'll provide them a fancy report that shows them, here's what we did to you, here's how we got in, here's how to remediate your issues. So you have all the steps to fix it up. And I mean, the biggest difference between us and the cyber criminals is that they won't get that fancy report, nor do they have permission to do it.
So Terry, you have a top 10 list of all the threats. Help us understand what some of those big ones are. Dave talked about getting in through email.
Right.
What are some of the threats that are out there?
Yeah, so I mean, the biggest one right now is through phishing emails, because nobody is attacking firewalls anymore and getting detected. I mean, why would they go through all that effort when all they have to do is send a crafty looking email to somebody and have them click on a link or open an attachment, and then they get compromised? And that's what was the number one way in 2020, because the CISOs were caught off guard with the pandemic, and all of a sudden now we can't protect our employees inside the corporate firewall. Now we have to protect them in their own homes with their Best Buy router that they just bought. So it's very, very hard to keep everybody safe. And a lot of folks working from home, were getting compromised. And then the moment they connect to the VPN into the company, then they would infect the company. So, and then it would cause a ransomware. So as you hear, like, ransomware pretty much is the number one form of online extortion happening right now. You could buy ransomware kits, and you can earn like $5 million by sending a couple of emails. And there's a couple of other issues that we see too, like Dave and Nabil mentioned. A lot of companies don't have full visibility into what's happening inside their company, which we call insider threats. But it doesn't mean it's a malicious employee. It could be an unwilling employee that endangered the company by misconfiguring something, or maybe clicked on a link he wasn't supposed to. Now the hacker is inside the business, and there's no detection in place to know he's there. But there are things in place like, or I should say, there's problems that occurred around cloud storage, for example. We see a lot of employees that are copying sensitive information into their OneDrive or their Google Drive so they can work from home, or maybe have a copy of it in case they ever left their employer. And IT departments can't see people doing that. They can't see that the files are being copied. There's issues where maybe their corporate website is being hacked into, and cyber criminals are injecting code that would infect every visitor that shows up. So we've seen cases where that happened, and every visitor got a PDF downloaded to their computer, and the moment they opened it, it tried to infect their computer, and they tried to get lawsuits against the company for infecting their network. Also, I met with what both Dave and Nabil mentioned around awareness training is going to be key.
Yeah, I was going to ask about training because in our prep calls, you guys all talked about training. So,
Yeah.
So what is that training? And Dave talked about, putting some pretty serious teeth behind it when you put into an employee's, performance review. But what does that training look like? And because, like, as you said, especially this year, you had to work from home, right?
Yeah. So basically what's going to happen is employees are going to receive emails that look pretty legit. And if they click on something or provide their credentials, the moment they hit enter, it's going to reroute them to a page that says, you've been phished. This is a test. Here's like a 1 to 3 minute video training on what you did wrong and like how to spot a phishing email. And
so that's part of the training. So they'll send out kind of a fake one to try to catch people.
Right.
That's right. Yeah, the executive team will see who the clicky people are. We'll say that like to click on all these attachments, and because we've had a real case where somebody got hit with ransomware, and the guy kept relaunching the attachment, so the ransomware got re-ransomed and re-ransomed, and at one point we had to negotiate with the cyber criminals to kind of decrypt 3 layers of encryption. So it also gives management a nice report that shows them, where some employees need extra help. And of course, there's even some companies that says, hey, if you fail this 3 times, like you're fired because you'll compromise the company. And they don't understand that when a company gets hit with ransomware and you have to dish out that kind of money, we've seen companies laying off their employees because they can't afford them.
And you bring up a good point, right? And some of the pushback we've always seen from organizations is that we can't have all our employees take this course.
Yeah.
We have to keep the lights on. They've got their day jobs to do. So one of the things that we always advise is take your folks that have access to the most critical piece of your infrastructure and have them go through this test, right? So you look at, hacks of the past, starting with, where Sarbanes-Oxley all came from, Enron, right? Forget the fact they had multiple books, but you essentially had people that had access to sensitive information, but it was also a toxic set of access, right? So, you think about the most simplistic accounts payable, accounts receivable, right? Or you can't create a vendor and pay the vendor at the same time. So you could do a lot of malicious stuff there. So, it ultimately comes back down to implementing compliance controls. But these controls have to be continuous and they have to be monitored, right? So, going back to what Terry mentioned, focus on your privileged users, focus on the folks that have keys to the kingdom, so that you don't have these types of issues. I think we all remember the city of San Francisco, where the privileged user took the credentials, he was laid off, but he had all the passwords to the entire network and all the routers and switches, and he said, "All right, see you later." Never get the account or the password, right? So, your privileged users, you need to ensure whether it's NIST-based controls, your Cloud Security Alliance controls, your CIS framework. Terry mentioned cloud storage. That's huge. I mean, if you just Google AWS S3 hacks, you will see a whole bunch of companies getting data just stolen from them. And it's back to configuration, right?
Yeah.
And it's not malicious all the time. Everyone's moving at the speed of business, right? And you give them the right access and they think they've done it correctly. But it's a small configuration, right?
Yep.
Or a minor configuration that they missed that now gave read access to the entire Republican voter data in the state, right?
So that's what's happening also with the companies that they don't have a proper response plan put in place. They think that, and this goes to the mindset of the most of the senior executives right now. They're like, oh, well, I think if I just buy antivirus, encryption, and a firewall, I'm safe.
Yep.
But these are all traditional technologies that 80% of your cybersecurity budget is going towards. But the moment a cyber criminal bypasses those technologies, they have nothing in place to know that there's somebody lurking in their system for 6 to 18 months prior to being detected. and then they don't have a proper response plan to get the cyber criminals out.
But what's different? I mean, is it because of the move to cloud? Why are we seeing so many more hacks now? Or is it just the news, the media's kind of tuned into them now?
Well, there's a couple of things. One of them is lack of resources. There's not enough cybersecurity experts out there to help protect companies. The other issue is sometimes they'll say, yeah, we've deployed a SIM in there, but the problem is that it requires a dedicated, specialized resource to look at those solutions. And it can't be the IT guy who's now tasked with cybersecurity. It's got to be a specialized individual, and those guys are expensive. Yeah. And so they'll say, yeah, I have a SIM running, but nobody's watching the console. And they'll say, yeah, I got breached. Oh yeah, 7 months ago. Shoot, nobody was watching. So
yeah,
you mentioned Terry. You mentioned people with their home computers. That was one of the things that we stopped right away. We pretty much mobilized, and this was a little bit before Corona, but we gave everybody laptops, and that was the only way they could get in, through the VPN, through a company-owned device, and that helped a lot. And we still had challenges like you've talked about, but
so have you now deployed EDR technology, like endpoint detection and response technology?
Mm-hmm.
Have you done that?
Yep, we have. So they addressed that. We addressed that with the forensic folks pretty early on, because that's obviously one of your biggest vulnerabilities. So, and
not many people realize that when you get hit with a ransomware, they think that they can just remove the virus and get back to normal. You got to replace that network.
Yeah, absolutely.
They don't realize the pain of this.
Yes. Is that because it's just irretrievably infected, or because you have to build it stronger? So what is why?
It's because the Active Directory skeleton keys get stolen. So what happens is, if you go in, let's say, format a computer, reinsert him into the domain, well, there's ways for this malicious software to bypass the administrator credentials. It's got system level privileges and starts reinfecting that computer the moment it gets into the network.
Yeah, and that's exactly what happened to us.
Yeah, you got to really rebuild that. You got to rebuild a parallel network. You got to rebuild a whole new Active Directory from scratch, with EDR on there, and start bringing in computers one by one with EDR technology built onto it, installed, or else you can get reinfected. The moment you connect that bridge to the old environment, you're toast.
We had these little dumb little network extender, not network extender, but where you a hub, dumb hubs, and those, we had those out in our plant, and that's how it infected the whole plant. We got those, and there was no control over those at all, and it just pushed it out to every device that was on the network, even our access points up in the manufacturing plant, and were infected. So.
Yeah.
I think there's a couple of other reasons, right? And Dave and Terry touched upon some of the critical ones, but there's also things that are often overlooked. So cloud is absolutely changing the landscape, right? The other thing is, Terry kind of touched on the whole SIM. It's I've got something, so I'm good. It's that false sense of security, right? I've got something to go find the needle in the haystack. Well, what haystack are you looking at? And what else is in the haystack, right? So you have to be more proactive. So that's just one example. But ultimately it comes down to, how do you surface that risk and put the onus back on the business? If you don't put the onus back on the business, IT is held responsible and to resolve the problem, and they're going to go back to their IT ways, right? And everyone comes up with a new framework, a new architecture that's going to solve everything. But ultimately, you need to show people that, here, this is risky, and start looking at newer technologies. Start looking at, not falling back on these monolithic platforms and legacy solutions to try to solve your problem, because A, it's going to take time. B, goes back to Terry's point about those resources are expensive and hard time finding them, right? I'll use a perfect example. Today, we've got a lot of folks looking at, identity solutions from various different vendors, new cloud-first vendors that allow you to quickly deploy these solutions, right? Versus going back to a 6-month, 9-month project and tons of service hours to deploy. It's it's undesirable for most CXOs looking at, reducing that total cost of ownership, right, and still getting that immediate ROI from their investment.
But it comes back to that comment also. It's like, oh, well, Nabil, I'm a small business. No one's going to want to hack me, right?
Yeah.
But they don't realize that, they're the number one target, because cyber criminals know they don't have the time, money, or resources to handle a cybersecurity incident.
Yep. So, and it's not always technology, right? Not to play on words, target, but if you kind of go back to that target hack, right? Everyone and their mother has tried to sell security solutions to target after that hack. Hey, I've got something that's going to solve world hunger for you. When in reality, the account that was hacked belonged to a vendor. So if they just had proper business processes where the vendor was terminated from that third-party company, a sponsor within Target was notified of that termination, they could have been more proactive and removed that account, right? Folks today aren't even cleaning up their house today, right? So you go back to, are these new threats? No, some of them are, an old way of doing security or implementing security, like privilege access management, for example. Everyone still relies on having persistent accounts within their environment. Terry talked about Active Directory accounts still, being persistent and available. All that does is increases your surface for attack, right? Yeah. And if you want to reduce that, you got to get rid of those accounts. Look at a new way to do privilege access management. Look at more software-defined network policies as well, rather than going back to some of those older technologies, right? Because
when we were at Novell, remember we had the 0-day start, 0-day stop. Remember that concept?
Yeah, 0-day start was a great concept. It's the minute you're in your HR system, I will automatically give you access to the right resources. And the selling point was business efficiency. Well, that didn't translate to, good investment from a business standpoint. However, when you flip that around and said, the minute the person left the organization, I could remove their access across the board, that became a selling point.
So talk about the kind of IT versus business. I mean, because you're talking about business, pretty fundamental business processes that should be in place for vendors, for employees, that really should have nothing, well, I don't want to say nothing to do with IT, but that are really managed or implemented, executed by the business. So what is the appropriate governance to get all these different entities kind of, singing from the same hymn book so they all understand what the challenge really is?
I think you hit the nail on the head. It is governance, right? It's people, process, technology. Technology is just one component of it. But if you don't empower people to take the right, improve on their security posture, and change the process, you're going to be stuck in the same, hole again, right? It's folks have this mindset that compliance cannot equal security when it should. Right? So it starts with governance. The onus needs to be on the business to say, hey, does Terry need access to these 5 things? And you can't have a manager just go, absolutely, he works for me, select all, approve all, right? You got to come back and say, well, one of these things that Terry has access to, nobody else in your organization has access to it, right? You might want to flag that as a risk. Hey, Terry has access to a critical piece of infrastructure application here that could allow him to, create a vendor and pay that vendor at the same time, right? That's a separation of duties violation. Quick, remove that access.
We also got really tough on vendors. We had a situation, during all this where we had a partner that we did a lot of business for them, and they were very security conscious. And as soon as they heard about this, they shut us off. I mean, one day it was stopped, and that was a huge chunk of our business. So that was obviously motivation to get things fixed quickly. But we got really tough on our vendors, and required a lot of things from a security standpoint from them. And you're right, governance. But besides that, getting really tough on your users and who has access to what. That was key. And me as the IT director and my staff, we, between that and sending out the phishing emails, we got to be kind of notorious, and we had to kind of watch our backs. Well,
let me ask you, Dave, when before you had all this in place, I'm sure you went to management and said, yeah, I need all these toys and all these things, and they told you what?
They weren't willing to spend the money. to be honest, right up front, like I said, nothing had ever happened. So, we're okay. We were a growing company, and we'll be all right. What we've got in place is fine. And it just wasn't. It was woefully short.
How do companies know how much to do? Because you can always spend more, right? So you've talked about kind of figuring out what the risk is. So how do you figure out how big the breadbasket is, and therefore what you actually need to protect it?
I think
you can go overboard, right?
Oh yeah, you can. I think that risk assessment again is key. Once you have that done and you see everything that's a risk for you, a ton of ours was patching servers and making sure they're up to date. But there are things that jump out at you. Endpoint protection and email and a lot of those things. The big things will jump out, and those are, you really don't have any choice but to fix those. And it's a matter of it was always the biggest key to all this was getting support, and in my case the owners of the business, and getting them to realize how important this is.
So when you had the breach occur, did they come back to you and say, Dave, how could this have happened?
They were a little careful about that, because it was I did bring that up, that we were not as protected because we didn't want to spend the money, but had to be careful.
Yeah, that's one of the advice I give to IT guys, because they're trying really hard to tell management we need all these things, right? I mean, now the Biden executive order says we need all this stuff too. Now they got more ammunition, but if management always says no, have them sign a paper saying, Mr. CEO, I advise you need this here. Sign this that you said you don't want it.
Yeah.
So I cover my ass.
Yeah, exactly.
It sounds very much like what cloud providers do with that shared responsibility. Here's what we do, and here's what you need to do. Yeah. But ultimately, what you need to do isn't well documented, right? So I would say, piggybacking on that risk assessment that Dave talked about, implement a good cybersecurity framework, right? Now, it depends on your industry, but a really good one to follow is NIST, whether it's the ISO 27000 family, the 800-53. There's a lot of them out there. But ultimately, what it comes down to is, what are your critical pieces of infrastructure that you need to protect, right? Do you have a strong identity and access controls around it? Are you ensuring least privilege? Identify your risky access, your set of users, and then define policies on how you're going to mitigate it, right? So if I came back to you, Dave, and I said, hey, Terry has access to acronym_acronym group.domain.forest. Is this critical? You're not going to know what it is. You're going to punt it. So you have to refine almost that business glossary. You have to meld IT terminology with business risk and put that in front of the user to get them to move. Because if they don't move, you're back to the same problem from the start, right? Yep. And you have to be able to improve on the business process. I'll give you a perfect example. Healthcare. Healthcare is the #1 place where it's very, very hard to implement stringent security policies, authentication policies. Why? Because of patient care. The minute you slow them down, they're not able to provide the urgent care that you're supposed to, right? So you have to look at other ways to be more frictionless, or provide that frictionless access to your end users as well. Especially healthcare. But then you can go down the road, right? You can look at finance, and you can look at retail. Retail, it's protecting PII data, it's credit card information, right? So those compliance controls are really what you need to identify in that risk assessment. What's important, and then start down that path. Don't boil the ocean. You boil the ocean, you end up with, here's a budget that I need to get approved, and everything gets slashed.
Yeah. Are all the threats and ransomware attacks that are in the news recently, have they been big enough to kind of get the executives' attention to say, hey, we need to do something about this? Because I feel like before we didn't really talk about it as much, but now, I feel like every other week it's in the news.
It is. But again, I firmly believe that folks are trying to solve the problem, right? But Terry mentioned it, lack of resources, lack of focus. You're just implementing technology to implement technology, right? I'll give you an example. SAP had an exploit a few months ago. It was across one of their middleware stacks. Now, the exploit was known And there was a CVE published, but SAP users never patched their environment, right? So patching didn't happen. Now, what the hackers did with that exploit is they created rogue accounts within the system. So 4 months later, everyone's talking about patching. Customers go up, patch their SAP environment, but these rogue accounts have now been created and they've been lying dormant for the right time for them to strike. And I have a feeling there's a lot of that out there right now that people aren't aware of. Sort of the sleeper accounts, if you will. And they'll jump up. Look at the pipeline hack. They fixed one problem, which halted, the flow of gas across the eastern seaboard. But they solved that problem, and then all of a sudden they lost communication to all of their suppliers almost like the third day. Well, that's just an indication of there's more problems there that persisted from that first hack that they just didn't go about solving. You can't be reactive to every problem. You got to have proactive solutions in place as well if you're going to do, really good security at your organization.
I can public versus private companies.
Sorry, say that again.
Is it different for public versus private companies?
That used to be the notion that only public companies need to have all these controls to meet Sarbanes-Oxley, HIPAA.
Right.
Absolutely not the case anymore, right? If you're a private company and you don't have things like SOC 2 Type 2 or good operational controls, or as Dave mentioned, a good vendor risk management process, public companies won't do business with you. If you don't have GDPR controls as a private company, you're not going to have European Union companies do any business with you either, right? So it applies to everyone now, irrespective of public or private.
Yeah, we're a private company, and it exactly what Nabil said. But I will tell you that our owners, after we got through this, they became very much aware, and almost to that level of, hey, Dave, did you patch? Did you get the servers patched today? That sort of thing. So yeah, they became very, very aware and very great guys, and took it in stride, and we made it better. So they responded very, very well to all the problems that we had. But
it's unfortunate it has to get to that level in order to do it,
Yeah, it is. And you, CXOs shouldn't just look at budgeting to get some of the latest and greatest, no-name brands in their infrastructure. Everyone heard the term CASB and said, oh, I'm going to discover shadow accounts and shadow IT and bring in a CASB. Okay, well, it's discovered 30 applications that your organization is using. Now what? Right? Did you know that your Salesforce, access to your Salesforce is falls on your business? IT isn't managing access. IT comes along and says, I'll give you a single sign-on to Salesforce. But what happens within Salesforce is on you, the business. Well, they have no clue. And that's how you have people, and I'll give you the example of salespeople leaving organizations, stealing entire customer data and going to their other, competitor. And that's all because there's unfettered access to the CRM data. And they just take it.
It's a balance, right? Because you want your employees to be agile. You want them to be able to kind of serve the customer, make decisions, fix supply chain issues. So it's a balance, and you don't want them to be saying, "Oh, you're creepy, you're you're tracking my every movement." So it's a tightrope, right? So how do you?
It absolutely is. You have to balance security with agility. So you have to let them have access, but then you tell the business user, "Hey, did you know that your employee in the East Coast region is looking up customer data in the West Coast?" It's that simple, right? And you tie that back to. It's not the big brother approach, but it's more of that education that Terry talked about. All right, let me have you sit down and take a 5-minute course on how to share intellectual property within the company, how to access things the right way, and this is what you should and should not do, right? Yeah. It's that whole process. So now the individual will think twice about accessing something they're not supposed to.
And that's why we're hearing more about, now we're going to go zero trust.
Yeah.
Right. This new framework. So that's going to be expensive, and we'll see how that goes.
Yeah. I mean, and zero trust is, again, I try to tell people it's a framework. And the underpinnings of zero trust have everything from, strong authentication, least privilege, continuous monitoring of controls, software-defined access policies, all kinds of things are in there. But again, don't try to put in a budget for, I'm going to solve for zero trust. Pick and choose what's most critical and how you're going to protect it. Do that assessment and then go after parts of that framework.
And that's what we're seeing also, during, especially last year, where everybody had to start working from home, there was a lot of misconfiguration. And we've seen a lot of cases where, especially backup servers, they create their backup all encrypted. All that part is fine. But then the backup was left open. So you're still able to pull the backups copy down. So misconfiguration is going to be a big problem.
It's a challenge. Talk to me about the impact of future technologies, because you're talking about assessing our current environment, but we talk about blockchain, we talk about IoT. I read an article last week about, I think it was a casino that was hacked through an IoT
tank
that was in the fish tank. Yeah, it was monitoring the temperature in the fish tank. So what is the impact of future technologies? Do things just get worse?
I think it's going to get worse for sure, because now it's going to be a free-for-all. So people are going to get the latest Internet of Things device, bring it into the company. And these devices were never really meant to be secured or, patched or any of this stuff, or even have like endpoint detection on it. Not alone even connected to the network, especially if you're talking about operational technology, like in the pipeline stuff. It's just going to leave more holes open for the company to be exploited.
Yeah, and you have to treat IoT devices as another piece of your identity framework, right? Because a lot of times IoT devices use a sort of service account, if you will. So who's got access to that service account? Who's impersonating that IoT device or leveraging it? Now you're seeing bots across organizations. Who's hijacking a bot and trying to get access to critical information. You have organizations moving, to containers and security that's governed through APIs. Well, who's using that API, right? You have organizations, developers going out and going to GitLab and downloading an API for their portal, their company portal. But that API has 5 embedded APIs within it that all call out to either Facebook login or something else, and your PII information is going out. And so, it's one thing to be on the bleeding edge of technology and keep up, that speed of business by bringing all the stuff in, but it's another to really put some controls around it. So bots, APIs, IoT or OT devices all together. And that's why I also believe that you got to look at the network security in a completely different way as well, right? Back to you, Terry or Dave. Any comments on that one?
Yeah, I guess I just have a few wrap-up questions. So, Dave, I want to go back to some questions that have come up for you. So, have hackers come back? So, once they're in, do they try again? Because they say, oh, maybe you haven't really patched things the way you should. So if you guys, I guess for each of you, have you seen repeat hacks?
We didn't see it happen with us, but I did hear about, and I'm sure Nabil and Terry have a lot of stories, but I have heard stories where, if they don't see you making any changes or improvements to try and keep them out, they'll keep coming back. But it didn't happen to us, and maybe that's because we got proactive very quickly. So
if I was a cyber criminal, I would definitely go back after you. I mean, I want to retire in a week. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
So absolutely, yeah.
But it would be harder because once you're on the front page of the New York Times, then you have all the budget in the world to go and solve that problem.
I guess so, huh?
So it does make it harder, but it doesn't completely eliminate it, right? So there are stories of repeat hacks for sure.
Okay.
Yeah. We're seeing a lot more of what's called business email compromises now. So what's happening is people don't realize that this is around passwords. A lot of people reuse the same password everywhere. And when they register their password, let's say on a real estate website, and they use their corporate email address on it, maybe that real estate company gets breached. And that password that gets leaked with it is the same password to log into your email or your company. And they'll reuse that same information and sign in, and causing an email business compromise.
So who are the people out there to go help? So as we start to kind of wrap up this conversation, because honestly, I feel like we could talk for days about this, and you guys have some great advice, but what kind of organizations, what kind of people? Obviously, Terry, we brought you in as the ethical hacker. So what kinds of resources should companies go out and look for to help plug the holes, or if, God forbid, they have an attack, to kind of make sure that they're secure?
Okay, the biggest comment I hear is that I have my IT guy, I got it covered. My IT guy is my brother-in-law, he's a plumber. Okay, so IT, think of IT as your general family doctor, right? Would you ever ask your family doctor to perform laser eye surgery on you? Most people would say no. So if you need to consult a cybersecurity expert or a team that can complement him to look at things he may have missed. So, we work with any companies that are like 3-person shops all the way to 900 employees. We work with all ranges. A lot of these guys have the same problems, regardless of what industry you're in. So, a lot of times ethical hackers will actually help save their business, because we're going to see things that you guys didn't think about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Are most of the attacks targeted? I mean,
no.
Do they go after a big company?
Not always. No, most of the time they're just part of a gigantic net. It's like, show me everybody on the internet running this version of Exchange, for example, like what happened recently. Well, poof, here's a list of 5,000 people, and boom, a bot goes out and attacks them all at the same time.
Crime of convenience.
And whoever responds with, that phishing scam, it's convenience at that point, right?
Right. So, how do you deal with the ransomware attackers? Does everybody pay?
So the answer should be no, you don't pay. But sometimes companies don't have a choice, like what happened with Dave, right? The backups got encrypted. We had a company that we worked with, their backups got encrypted, so did the other backups, so they had to revert to tape backup. But the problem is that the server that controls that tape was encrypted and corrupted, which means it would have taken weeks to re-index that tape. So they had to go to an outside firm, a data recovery firm, to get that data off the tape. It's a real messy situation, but sometimes they don't have a choice. It's sometimes cheaper to pay that ransom than to start all over.
Oh, yeah. And I think it depends on the organization, right? If it is critical infrastructure, you can't help but to pay to restore services and get it back, right? In Dave's case, they had to shut down, which was the only course of action. Yes, it's slowed down manufacturing, probably hurt the company's bottom line, but didn't impact lives, right? So I think you kind of have to look at it from that standpoint.
Yeah, that was one of my other questions we didn't really get to, is when does the government get involved? When do the stakes go up? So we can do that as a follow-up, because I think that's a whole other discussion. Is it a business? Is it, a target? Is it my credit card versus national security? So let's not go there now, but
we probably need 1 or 2 hours for that.
Yeah. Okay, so what I want to ask you guys is, and you've all talked about kind of advice. So what's the one piece of advice? Where should somebody start? We talked about the risk assessments. Is that it? What else should companies do to kind of dip their toe in the water and figure out how bad their holes really are? So Dave, let's start with you. Go ahead,
Dave.
Oh, I'm sorry. To me, it's the risk assessment. I mean, if you were like us, you really didn't have any clue where the holes were. And that's going to, to be honest, the report that we got, I want to say it was 25, 30 pages long. And again, a lot of those are, patching servers and that sort of thing. And like Nabil said earlier, if you have to kind of look at that and figure out which ones you can afford to take. Some of these patches are really obscure things that might never happen again. You have to kind of prioritize things and go from there. But to me, the risk assessment's the key.
Okay. Nabil.
I agree. So following on the risk assessment, and you shouldn't look at those 20 pages as, oh my God, right? It should be, go to the last page, look at the final summary and go, okay, and what is my overall risk that I can accept, right? And to Dave's point, then work backwards. What are the must-haves? And that'll usually map to having a strong cybersecurity framework. But you cannot have really good information security without strong physical security as well, right? So you have to sort of look at that convergence of physical and logical security. and base your whole program around that. You don't want tailgaters walking in, right, and gaining access to whether it's networks or just files sitting on a desk somewhere as well, right?
Yep.
New language, tailgaters. I'm learning a lot. Okay, Terry, final words.
Yeah, so same thing. I agree with everybody here. So the assessment is going to be key. So I'll give you an example. So one of the things that we offer is we call the report card audit. And it's basically, it shows you where your company is today based against the NIST cybersecurity framework. So it's going to find things like machines that are unpatched, user accounts that are still active in Active Directory that haven't been with the company for years. It's going to show all these things, and it even comes with a management plan that says, hey, if you fix these priorities, it's going to lower that risk score.
Mm-hmm.
So companies need to get this so they know where they are today and what's lacking so they can move forward.
Yeah.
And if you deal with consumers, if your business caters to the B2C community or the consumer community, make them aware of the breach. You have to do that. Yeah. Otherwise, your reputation is gone. And then it's not just recovering from that risk or that attack. It's recovering your brand right before it's too late.
Yeah.
Great point.
A lot of scary stuff out there. So I want to thank ConneXiOn would like to thank our expert speakers, Dave Elliott, Nabil Nazar, and Terry Cutler. And we'd also like to thank Legion Star for their sponsorship. I've been taking notes, so there's a lot to learn, and we will be publishing a recap. So follow ConneXiOn on LinkedIn for more information about participating in the community, making custom connections, and impacting conversations like this. Watch our LinkedIn page for information about our next session, which will be focused on digital marketing and social media in the CPG industry. So again, a replay of today's conversation will be available on our website along with summaries from our speakers. So thanks again, everybody, and stay safe.
Thank you.